Good afternoon to everybody. I think that by now all attendees online have been allowed to participate. So let me welcome all of you to our webinar seminar today, organized by the Institute for Minority Rights at Eurac Research. I'm Roberta Medda-Windischer, Senior Researcher at the Institute for Minority Rights. I have the pleasure to moderate the discussion of today's seminar entitled All the New Minorities, Regional Synergies, Differences and Perspectives. Our discussion revolves around the debate on all the new minorities and the policies to protect and promote their rights. A debate that for a long time has been kept separated from one another, so minorities on the one hand and migration on the other. The predominant attitude, especially in the political discourse, has been, and to a certain extent is still so, that long-standing minorities and individuals and groups with a migration background are completely different categories with completely different needs and claims. And this is, of course, true to some extent and in some perspective. In the last decade, however, the debate has been enriched by studies and analysis, studies to which I also modestly contributed to, the similarities and synergies among these groups. Digging below the surface, the issue is in fact much more nuanced and less clear-cut, including from a legal perspective, especially if we look at the available legal instruments on minority protection. However, especially at the beginning of the debate around the years 2000, this field of research was still seen as almost a taboo and ostracized, especially in some countries that feared a proliferation of expenditure and multiplication of claims, but also among some long-standing groups and minorities that feared a sort of dilution of their rights as well as their budget and resources. And then slowly perspectives changed and the term new minorities started to be used more frequently and accepted in many circles. Although at the same time different meaning and interpretations of this term, depending on the context, also emerged. So to make a long story short, among scholars and minority groups, it begins to be acknowledged that in the end, what we are discussing is a claim, a quest for the protection and promotion of one's own identity and diversity in a world that tends to homogenize, uniformize human beings, that tend to reduce diversities or at best include them in categories, boxes that for some are even cages. Whereas human identities are multiple, multidimensional, and diverse and fluid. But if from a theoretical viewpoint there has been a sort of breakthrough in the research, with many accepting the theoretical foundation of this debate, at the same time some started to raise the objection that in the end, okay, perhaps theoretically minority protection can be extended to migrants and individuals with migration background, but in reality, so the objection goes, most of them have other priorities and are not interested in diversity protection or diversity promotion as old traditional historical minorities do. And in fact, what was missing in this respect was an empirical and comprehensive study on the views, claims, needs, opinions of new minorities themselves. And today, I'm proud to discuss with our distinguished panelists, some who are online, others here in presence, that I will shortly introduce them to you. So I'm proud to discuss with you the final results of Katharina Crepaz's research that precisely aims to fill this gap in the research. So today we will discuss the specific results of Katharina's research, and this will give us also the opportunity to discuss on the synergies, similarities, differences between all the new minorities, and the broad quest for diversity, special measures versus equality, and more generally discuss where minority protection and minority rights research stand now and is moving in the future. So let me introduce the speakers of today's seminar. As I mentioned, today Katharina Crepaz will present her final findings of her research. Katharina is a senior researcher at the Eurac Research Institute for Minority Rights. She has an habilitation in health sciences with a special focus on diversity governance from the Technical University of Munich, where she teaches on health, gender, diversity, and migration. Her research focuses on the inclusion and participation of marginalized groups and on the nexus between diversity, health, resilience, and well-being. Our guest panelists are Fernande Varenne, who since 2017 is the UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues. He is also a visiting professor at the University of Pretoria, the National University of Ireland in Galway, University of Hong Kong, and is renewed as one of the world's leading experts on international human rights of minorities. And on this subject, he has authored 100 publications in more than 30 languages. Then we have online as well Emanuele Massetti. He's assistant professor of political science at the University of Trento and also associated fellow at the Center on Constitutional Change at the University of Edinburgh. His research focuses on political parties, ethno-territorial politics, multi-level institutional reforms, and populism. One of his latest publications is The People and the Nation, Populism and Ethno-Territorial Politics in Europe. And then we have, my left, here in presence, Eduardo Ruiz-Vietez is a professor at the University of Deusto in the Basque Countries, where he, among others, he acts as vice rector for university strategy. He was also the dean of the Faculty for Social and Human Science and director of the Human Rights Institute. He has been a member of the Spanish Council for Integration of Migrants. And his fields of research are integration policies, national conflicts, minority rights, and the relation between human rights and religious, linguistic, and cultural diversity. So our discussion today will last approximately 1.5 hours until 5:30. I encourage all participants from the audience to comment and raise their questions by raising their hands if they are in presence, or by using the Q&A that will be moderated by my colleague Alexandra Tomaselli, that I thank. So I'll give now the floor to Katharina, who will have 20-25 minutes to present her research. The floor is yours, Katharina. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Roberta, for the introduction and the welcome. Hello also from my side here. So as Roberta already mentioned, I have the pleasure today of presenting the findings of my research project and on the differences, similarities, and perspectives of old and new minorities at the regional level. To introduce you very shortly to the research project itself, it was titled MinMig, Accommodating Linguistic, Religious and Cultural Diversity through a Comparative Analysis of Minorities and Migrants' Claims. And it was funded by the Autonomous Province of Bolzano through the call for researcher mobility. And I know that someone from the representative from the Office for Research of the province has also signed up for our webinar today, so I would like to welcome her to the online participation via Zoom. And for our research interest of the project, as Roberta already outlined a bit in her introduction, we want to know whether new minorities and migrant minorities hold similar claims to old national minorities, and whether some of the protection measures that are in place for old minorities might be beneficially extended to new minorities. And Roberta herself has published quite extensively on this topic, and this is also the theoretical framework that I've used to devise the project. So of course, for time reasons, we won't be able to go into this right now, but I encourage you to look at her writings on the matter. What we took as the starting point for the research project were international documents that are in place for old minorities. So first, legal documents like the Framework Convention, but also indicators that had been developed to assess the inclusion of old minorities. And we took these documents and indicators and identified some primary issue areas and topics. And these topics were language, education and media, religion, culture, social life, political participation, intergroup relations, and non-discrimination. So these topics were really present among most of the documents and indicators that we had looked at. And so therefore they also served as kind of the structure, the basis to draft our questionnaire on whether new minorities would be interested in having similar rights or similar claims to those in place for old minorities. I will talk a bit more about the topics later on, also when I go into the details of the project. But for now, let me mention our case studies. So we looked at the European region, South Tyrol, Trentino, Tyrol, so 2 Italian provinces and 1 Bundesland in Austria. And here on the left side of the slide, you can see where they are located. So for those of you that may be joining us from outside of Europe that are not that familiar here with the geography, just to let you know that it's an area located really quite centrally in Europe, and also bordering to Germany, which also explains the high percentage of German migrants that we have in both Tyrol and South Tyrol. However, just to already mention it at the beginning, we did not include those in our study because they speak the official language or one of the official languages and are therefore not likely to encounter difficulties or discrimination in terms of respect for diversity and culture. Why we chose the 3 regional case studies, so to have a perspective on the Euregio, also to provide more viable results for the provincial level, as the project is also funded here by the province, so it's also an important thing for us to create something that is then also of value here in the local context and for also practitioners. And of course, we have an interesting comparison to make here, as in Tyrol, there's quite a longer migration history as in Austria in general. Many of you probably know there were these Anwerbeabkommen that recruited the guest workers in the 60s and 70s. And so the migration history is longer, whereas in South Tyrol and Trentino, it was more traditionally regions that people migrated from and not necessarily to. So we do have a longer history, as you can see also here in the slide above. So the migration background, there's a larger number of persons with migration background, also foreign citizens in Tyrol than there is in South Tyrol and in Trentino. And of course, we also have different groups. So formerly Yugoslavian countries and Turkey, primarily in Tyrol, but Albania, Pakistan, Morocco, both Trentino and South Tyrol, but also Romania in Trentino, which I think is the largest migrant group in general in Italy. So also an overlap here. What we did regarding the methods and collecting data, there's no hard sampling frame available, so this was going to be a non-representative study in any case, but we had planned to do a location sampling, which was unfortunately very difficult due to the pandemic. So the project began in March of last year, so right at the outset of the pandemic in Europe as well. And therefore this location sampling, so going to the places where migrants tend to gather, cultural events, religious events, and so on, was very difficult. So we also opted for snowballing and for organizational contacts, and also used our interviewers, which we had one in each case study, and we then used also the contacts that they could provide. So we tried to recruit interviewers that were really well connected in the community as well. And of course, we have a target group that is generally quite difficult to reach, as shown also by a migrant data gap in many official statistics and questionnaires. We gathered in total 228 interviews with our interviewers in the 3 case studies, 100 additional ones in a web survey, but unfortunately there were quite high dropout rates. So we focused primarily on the data gathered through our interviewers. Before I go into the project results, let me just very quickly touch upon the notion of migrants as new minorities. As you, or as many of you probably know, there is no official definition of minority that is established, that is valid in all cases, so there are different definitions. And one of our panelists today, the UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues, Fernand de Varenne, he proposed a new and more inclusive definition in 2019, where also migrant or new minorities would be able to fit in the definition. So where there is no prerequisite of citizenship, but it's just people that belong to a minority group and that share certain characteristics of culture, religion, or language. So this is a definition that is open and more inclusive, and where migrants might also potentially fit. But I'm sure we can talk about this more in detail in the discussion afterwards. So whether this is something that is feasible, or whether this is something that maybe migrant groups want or are opposed to. So coming to the results of the project. As I already mentioned, we are a non-representative territory, so we can only talk about really the ideas and opinions and wishes voiced by our respondents. And here we have again the topic structure that was drafted in order following the international documents. Language, culture, religion, and social life, which I will present along the questions on cultural events, political participation, question on voting rights, and intergroup relations, feeling at home, and discrimination. Of course, I can only show you a very brief snippet of the whole data set, but I'm happy to answer any further questions or any things that interest you in the discussion afterwards. So quickly to the demographics, so that you know which types of populations we're talking about. Place of residence, so here you see right at the top, the regions, so where people come from. As you see, we have more participants from Tyrol than from the other 2 regions. What I think is more interesting is the age distribution, so this one here, where you see that the majority, almost 3/3, are between 18 and 44, so a relatively young sample, which also corresponds to the general population of migrants, which is younger than the general population. And then here you have the duration of residence. So as you see again in Tyrol, longer duration of residence than in the other 2 areas, which is of course also probably due to the longer migration history. And gender distribution is quite even. The citizenships, I didn't show them here because we have quite a variety, so a large other category. We put the largest ones for each case study in the questionnaire. However, those are the most represented ones, but there's also quite a variety of others. So just to mention a few: Egypt, Armenia, Brazil, Colombia, Ivory Coast, Cuba, and Ecuador. So really quite a variety, and the list goes on. Coming to our first topic that was identified in the international documents is the topic of language. So, of course, something that is quite crucial, I think, to old minorities. And we asked our participants the question whether they thought that interested students should have the possibility to learn the languages spoken by migrants in schools. And as you can see, a vast majority was in favor of this. However, in the comment box that we always offered, also at the top, at the bottom of the question, many commented that knowing the official languages and establishing a good command of the official languages is more important than perhaps additional offers that they might want to have in migrant languages. And I've put also two quotes here from the additional qualitative interviews that we have gathered, where the participants talk about this hybrid identification, so that they are part here and part from there. And for that, they also need to have the language from both parts. So this is an identification I think that is quite interesting, and that we have encountered quite frequently across the participants and also across the interviews. And then, of course, the importance of knowing the official language, the key to work, the key to social inclusion, as they put it here. We asked them about maintaining cultural traditions, so whether this is something that is important to them. And they mentioned that this is indeed important, but again, more this idea of this is a private matter, so maybe not like it would be the case often for old minorities, that they would like to have also public displays and so on of cultural events. This was not something that came up, but instead it's a private matter, and they would like also to follow a mixture of traditions from here and from there, so from families, country of origin, and from the regions that they live in right now. Regarding religious traditions, there's a similar picture, although the answer is a little bit lower, as you see, but most of them would like to maintain religious traditions, or it's important to them. And again, this notion that it's something personal, but that it's important to generate knowledge about different religions, so to have mutual understanding. And this real intercultural competence or intercultural dialogue, I think, is something that has emerged also quite frequently across the questions and across the data set. So this is something important. And what they mentioned is that religious traditions are family festivities that remind them of their childhood. So probably here, I think this is also something that might go as well for the population without migratory background, so that it's more Easter or Christmas that are being celebrated, but it's not for the religion, but for the family festivity. Regarding the topic of social life, we put a question on cultural events. So whether they think that there should be more cultural events organized by migrant communities, and as you can see, a large majority said yes, 85%. This could, of course, also be due to the time of data collection, so from December last year to May this year, when there was basically no events offered at all. So maybe this created an increased eagerness also to have events. And we then asked these participants that said yes, there should be more events, also about which type of events might be organized. And as you can see here, the variety really is quite broad. So from concerts to theater, dance, book readings, cinema. And then in the other category, we had culinary events as the most frequently mentioned one, followed also by political discussion and by celebrating holidays together. Coming to political participation, which is also a topic that is very important for both old and new minorities, we asked them whether there should be active voting rights for long-term residents, so for those that have lived in the region for 10 plus years. And as you can see, the majority was in favor of this. However, some said it should depend on the level of integration or only on the regional level, not on the national level. And what was quite frequently commented also is that we shouldn't create new special voting possibilities, but just make it easier to get the citizenship and then you can vote anyway. And for passive voting, 70% were in favor of that as well, so a little bit lower than for the active voting rights. And of course, for the debate on citizenship, this is, as Bauböck and Walchers also call it in their new book, a bit of a hen and the egg discussion. So what comes first, citizenship, and then they participate more, or they have to integrate, so to speak, first and then citizenship, and then they can be politically active. We also asked participants about the importance of active and passive voting rights. A majority, I think about 70%, said that they are important or very important. So this is something that is, I think, quite close to their interests and what they're interested in. And 24% would also consider running for office themselves. And here we also asked them about memberships of trade unions and political parties, and at least for South Tyrol, where we have the data available, the values here are relatively similar for migrants and the general population. For men, party membership is a bit higher, but other than that, it's really quite similar. To the topic of intergroup relations, we asked them whether they felt at home in their respective region or which statement describes their sense of belonging. And here we have to note that multiple answers were possible. So it's not exclusionary. So they could say that they feel at home somewhere else, like is mentioned here, but also in South Tyrol or in Europe. So this multiple identification is possible also in the question. And in the comments, they mentioned that wherever friends and family are with them, that's where they feel at home. So it doesn't really depend on the location. And others also said that they feel at home both in South Tyrol and in Morocco, for example, in this quote, but at the same time, they don't feel at home in neither place. So it's really a conflicting feeling. And the feeling of being at home for one commentator was overcome when they can go abroad, so when they are just Italian and when their Italianness, so to speak, is not questioned like it is in Italy. We then asked those participants that felt at home in the region also about what makes them feel at home. And here you can see quite interestingly also green spaces and cafes, bars, pubs, restaurants as the most frequently mentioned ones. So I think green spaces probably would be the same for many of the participants or many of the inhabitants of these regions without migratory background as well, so nature, mountains, and so on. And same for cafes, bars, and pubs, which of course are social meeting places, so interaction is important. And this is, of course, again, during the pandemic, so maybe this contributed to having these places more important when they are not accessible. And in the other category, we have family and friends, school, culture, the environment, personal freedom, and safety. Then to the final topic that I would like to present to you, discrimination, so whether they would describe themselves as members of a group that is being discriminated against. And as you see, the majority said no, which is, I think, quite a positive outcome, but of course, we can only speak for our respondents here. And the grounds for discrimination, so those that said yes, we asked them on what grounds they were discriminated against. And here you see that it's really quite a variety of grounds that they are giving. So nationality, of course, but also religion, color, language, gender. So I think here really to combat discrimination, it's very important to also follow an intersectional approach. And something that I wanted to show you, because I think it's quite an interesting quote, is this quote on silent types of discrimination or microaggressions. as they are often referred to, especially in the Anglophone literature in the US. So it's this type of discrimination where you are not actively, to say, discriminated against, but it's silent. So it's a perception that you have when you walk at night and there is a black face under your hoodie and not a white face, and you see that people maybe are reacting differently to you. Or then the person also said when there's the women on the bus, when they put their purses next to them so you can't sit next to them and things like that. So really this type of silent little things that are not provable, but it's something that they perceive regardlessly. And I think this is quite interesting because it shows that discrimination is not just something that is very outright, but also more little things, and maybe also something that we need to tackle in a more nuanced way. So what can we conclude from this very short and little overview of our research project here? I think that migrants are aware of their position in society, so they don't strive for protection mechanisms that are as far-reaching as those for old minorities. And I think that there are also certain areas where a shared approach would be possible, but I don't think that, at least at the moment, this is feasible because the political will is probably lacking in this case. Going through the topics, so new minorities are in favor of language classes also being offered, but they see the knowledge of the official languages as more important. So maybe there is a first difference to old minorities where language and the minority language really itself is a very crucial matter. Religion and culture are also seen as more private matters, as opportunities for intercultural exchange that are seen as crucial, so really getting to know each other. And this is connected also to the next point, to this hybrid identification, where new minorities want to be a part of society and less to differentiate themselves from maybe the majority population, like in the case of some old minorities. So this diversity equality debate that Roberta has also talked about in the beginning, which is something I think that will be with us also over the next few years. Political participation is important for both groups, as is establishing opportunities for participation for new minorities, and respect for diversity and protection from discrimination also emerge as shared concerns. And finally, to leave you some points for discussion, there are some policy recommendations that I think can be drawn from this. So include linguistic diversity and its advantages as a topic in schools, especially also making use of new technology that is closer to the lives of young people. So one respondent in the qualitative interview said to me, nobody watches TV anymore, so really there needs to be a diversification also of approaches here. Provide additional voluntary language classes for migrant languages, also to raise awareness about societal diversity for non-migrant students, I think. Make use of these young, multilingual and well-educated migrants to serve as role models and testimonials and bridge builders between the communities. Make use of the facilities that make respondents feel at home, so of nature, mountains, and also meeting places, where you could also then foster minority and majority encounters. For example, something that came to my mind would be to have a joint nature experience where you could combine things like biodiversity and social diversity, so to connect these two issues that are really at the prime importance for our societies, I think. To make intercultural dialogue a priority when distributing cultural funding, so to really see that this is something that is taken into account when assessing funding applications. And finally, of course, also to provide opportunities for political participation, especially for young migrants. If possible, have voting rights at the regional level, and if not, have a diversity mainstreaming approach for regional policies. And what I think is necessary, especially in Italy, create a national level discussion on non-citizenship and its implications for young migrants. As we've seen in the slide on discrimination, there is really an overlap of different types. So you should follow an intersectional approach to identify these categories and then also to draft maybe specific measures. So for example, for female migrants. And finally, and I hope that my research project here can serve as a bit of a kickoff and a pilot for this. I think we do need a large-scale and representative survey of migrant populations that could be done in the context of the European region. So we also have this both local routing and also cross-country comparison, and to also include a longitudinal panel dimension, especially now in the aftermath of the pandemic, which I think has changed many things, not just for migrants, but for societies in general. That is it for me. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Katharina. I would like to underline again the innovative dimension of your research that, as I said, fill in partly the gap that with empirical data, the gap in the research on old and new minority, and respond somehow also to the, as I mentioned before, the objection that new minorities have complete different claims and needs. And another innovative aspect of your research is that has been conducted from the point of view of the old minorities, point of view in the sense that your perspective was always a comparative perspective between old and new. We know that surveys and questionnaires among migrants are many, have been and will be many, so many that at a certain point there was a sort of survey harassment because migrants were asked, at least here in the province, continuously, and they were really fed up in a sense. But as researchers, a limitation that we had was always to find the answers that you perhaps that you have put together in this in a comprehensive study. We used to find them scattered in different surveys, and this was obviously a big limitation in our research. So now I would like to enlarge the debate and extend it to our guest speakers. And my question for the three guests is, what is your view on all the new minorities? Can they be protected through common mechanism, or do you think that other ways of dealing with diversity stemming from migration would be more beneficial? And I have one specific question for each of you. For Fernande Varenne, my question would be, in addition to your position on all the new minorities, also if you can tell us the reactions of representatives of member states to the report, to your report containing a more inclusive definition of minorities, the one that is open to new minorities. What was the reaction to most member states? And for Emanuele Massetti, my question, as I said, in addition to your position on all the new minorities, is more connected to the inclusion policies. So are there any lessons that can be learned from the old minority protection policies that can be helpful in drafting policies for new minorities? And for Eduardo Ruiz, my question would be about the old long-standing minorities. So what do you think would ease the reaction by old minorities towards this opening of minority protections towards new minorities? What do you think is their position in this regard? So I would give the floor now to Fernande Varenne. I hope he's online. I don't see him, but...
I am definitely online. Bon, voilà. Dankeschön, grazie mille. Merci Roberta, merci Eurac. Bonjour tout le monde. Scott, buongiorno a tutti. Well, I'd like to first begin perhaps by first congratulating Katharina. I agree, it's an innovative research project, but also it touches upon important and I would say even timely societal issues and even challenges. And if we look at it in a more broader way, we are experiencing worldwide great migration movements, especially in recent decades. And it's having a growing impact on the composition, if you will, and the operation of many societies. And I think we're seeing some growing pains related to that in a number of countries. The research also touches upon, in a way, even if it's perhaps more indirectly, growing tensions that we are often seeing in Europe, including in, I would suggest, in the growing populist, majoritarian, nationalist movements, which we're also seeing in North America, and such as was represented by the Make America Great Again movement, propelled by former US President Donald Trump. But to go back to the main issues, if you will, there are particularly interesting conceptual issues and perhaps a further need for research and clarification here. And one point I think that needs to be addressed and is being addressed by this research, but more will need to be done, is the whole concept of national minorities and where that fits exactly. Because the discussion has been or is on the expressions new and old minority, and I'm not sure what that actually involves. I assume that by national minority, there is a reference, although it's not always very explicit, on national minorities. Now, to go to the international level, at the international level, at the United Nations, there already is a kind of distinction that exists, at least to some degree in some of our instruments, between, on the one hand, the category of national minorities, which I will, for the purposes of our exchange, assume that this covers all minorities that are being referred to. There are two global treaties that actually refer specifically to national minorities. There's the UNESCO Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination in Education, and there's the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But most United Nations instruments do not distinguish between old and new minorities, because there is no reference to national minorities in most of our United Nations documents, except for those that I've referred to, the UNESCO Treaty on Discrimination in Education and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Usually, the expression or the formulation we have are ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities, which is more inclusive, as Katharina mentioned earlier. So instruments, so there is a conceptual nuance within international instruments, which I explained, and Katharina mentioned this also, in my annual thematic report to the United Nations General Assembly in October of last year. Now, that definition, if you will, that Katharina referred to hasn't quite trickled down completely yet. And I think I need to emphasize that this is why we largely have perhaps not a tension, but there is a little bit of a lack of overlapping, or perhaps discomfort, I would say, in Europe, and we can discuss this too. In Europe, there is a tendency of referring and focusing almost exclusively to national minorities, which, once again, for the purposes of discussion, I think we can connect to all minorities that Katharina has been mentioning. But for us at the United Nations, most of our instruments deal with new and old minorities together in terms of ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities. The word minorities in itself is not helpful. One has to actually precisely indicate which category of minorities are we referring to. Now, that's why the United Nations Human Rights Committee and myself as Special Rapporteur we actually have frequently insisted that the rights contained in provisions like Article 27 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights apply to users of sign language, for example, because they are members of a linguistic minority. And the issue as to whether they are a new or old minority doesn't enter into the calculation. The issue of whether they are a national minority is of absolutely no relevance in terms of that instrument for the United Nations. Ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities, as the UN Human Rights Committee has often repeated, in fact, includes migrants and refugees. And so migrants and refugees also have the right to practice their own religion, enjoy their own culture, and use their own language in community with other members of their group, because the rights in this provision and most of the global treaties and instruments are not time sensitive or status sensitive. They are not linked in any way with the duration of settlement or presence within the state or citizenship or any other status. So I think there's an interesting conceptual difficulty that you have in Europe, I'll dare say that, which does not exist to the same extent in United Nations mechanisms. Because what most of your regional instruments are dealing with are measures or rights that are targeting national minorities, not any religious, linguistic, or ethnic minority. And if I'm allowed just a few more moments, by the way, this would appear to be the main, not exclusive, but the main motivation behind states such as Austria, which was the main proponent, as you know, for the adoption of the UN Declaration on Minorities, to identify as quite a distinction to make in the title of the declaration itself by, I would say, pointedly indicating in a disjunctive way the Declaration on the Rights of Persons belonging to national minorities on one hand, or the rights of persons belonging to ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities. There's a reason for that disjunction, which has occurred in that UN document. And as for the state reactions to the broad definition in my report, which was Roberta's specific question, it has, in fact, there are two reports, and I think we need to understand that. There is the general, the first of my report, which defined, if you will, the specific meaning of minority, but there's the second report to the UN General Assembly, where I added a further clarification in that, but when we talk about minorities at the United Nations, we are referring to national or ethnic or religious or linguistic minorities. And those conceptually, there are significance to that, as I explained earlier. The reaction of states, generally very positive. The clarification that I propose explains why you do not need to be a long-term citizen, for example, to be considered a member of a linguistic minority under UN treaties. It also clarified why Roma, with or without citizenship or evidence of long-standing residence in the country, are considered to be ethnic or linguistic minorities. It also explains why people who use sign languages can be members of a linguistic minority, whether they're old or new, and why, for example, migrants can also constitute a religious minority in some countries. So generally the reactions from states have been one of appreciation of the clarification. The only opposition or negative reactions have been that it should be left to the state to determine who's a minority, which is not the way the concept operates in terms of international human rights law. Grazie mille.
Thanks a lot, Fernand, for your clarification. And yeah, there is a sort of elephant in the room that is missing, which is the capo torti definition that actually has influenced many national legislation that exclude, in the end, new minorities from the concept of minorities, because it requires the citizenship, and it's true that many European countries actually exclude from the scope of application of international instruments on minorities, migrants or individuals with migration background. So it is true that it's a very European problem or concern. Now I'll give the floor to Emanuele Massetti, who is online. Please, Emanuele, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberta, and good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to apologize for harassing you with my big face, but I was strongly advised to keep my mouth close to the computer when I'm speaking. So I hope that the audio is good enough. Concerning the questions that were posed to me, there is quite a lot of overlap between the two questions, so I try to answer them together. And in doing so, I will first of all bring a political science perspective, so a stronger emphasis on politics, and also an explicitation of the European perspective on dealing with minorities, which in a way basically enters into a dialogue with what was Professor Vernes was saying before about this gap between how states, policymakers, and even academics view minorities in Europe and how they are seen and normed at the UN level. So, from a European perspective, we need to understand that people might be perplexed in bringing new minorities in the same framework of old minorities, because European societies are differently from settler societies, supposed to be based on native populations that have inhabited the countries for a long time. So the situation is very different from settler societies, where the core ethnic group of those societies is formed by settlers and not by the native population, which has been marginalized, if not genocided, and reduced to a very marginal political force, so to speak, to the extent that new immigrant minorities might be much stronger in political terms than the native aboriginal communities of those countries. In Europe, the situation is very different. And therefore, the logic and the objective of the mechanism that are put in place by states to deal with old and new minorities are very different. And the main difference is that the claim on the land, which is put forward by what we call here old minorities, is perceived as much more legitimate politically. I'm not talking about norms here or laws, but politically is perceived to be much more legitimate than a supposed claim, which in fact is not there, advanced by new minorities. And this means that the objective of policies that are put and measures that are put in place by states in dealing with old and new minorities are different. The objective of states when it comes to old minorities is to reach peaceful and harmonious coexistence between the minority and the national majority. Whereas when it comes to new minorities, the objective is to achieve integration of new minorities in the host society. And of course, integration can mean different things. And the concept of integration can be stretched even to the point of meaning the same thing as pure coexistence of rather isolated cultural and ethnic communities. But in most cases, integration means to create at least dual identities, if not assimilate the new minorities into the host national identities, at least in the long run, through different generations. So the objective is different, that the underlying logic is different, and therefore it is difficult to think about using the same approach, the same paradigmatic approach of all minorities and new minorities. Coming to the second question, I think if there is something that we can learn from how states have successfully dealt with all minorities, and that can be applied also with new minorities, is to, first of all, avoid alienation, avoid the feeling that the state is indifferent to the presence of multiple identities. Like all minorities, also new minorities need to feel considered and to feel accommodated as much as this is possible. And of course, this is a matter of political negotiation. So if a lesson can be learned is to keep an ongoing, open and frank debate and dialogue between minorities. And this is why research projects like this are extremely important. Because differently from old minorities, new minorities in Europe are much less organized politically and also in terms of associations, not least because they come from different countries, different cultural backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, and therefore it's difficult to find a unified voice that represents all the new minorities. And that's why it's extremely important that we gather data, we gather information on the opinions of new minorities and on what they expect from themselves, but also from the host society and the institutions, the public institutions of the state and the territory in which they are living.
Thank you very much, Emanuele. And yeah, at the beginning you referred to Europe and non-European countries as also Fernande Varenne, who, by the way, had to leave. So it reminds me a bit of what also Michael Walzer said about thin and thick culture in Europe and in northern American states. So that to make this difference, that in European countries being sort of having thick culture is much more difficult to be open. This is what Michael Walzer said, to other diversities. Whereas in the United States or Canada, having this thin culture, then it's easier to be open to other diversities. But I'll give now the floor to Eduardo Ruiz, and who will bring again the perspective of the long-standing minorities. Please, Eduardo.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for having invited me to this seminar, particularly to Katharina and Roberta. and to have the opportunity to participate in this event with my Eurac colleagues and other colleagues which are online. Well, I think this is a very relevant topic indeed, and very necessary for the future of, I would say, Europe, but future of the organizing of our polities. I think that the debate is far from being solved, and not even many times very well formulated. And so there is a gap in which we have to put our attention, that's for sure. To begin with, the very concept of minority is not always used in not all the context. We can use this concept legally, politically speaking. So in different countries, they are very reluctant to use this, even the academy, to use this very concept. So to distinguish between old and new, that's another problem. What is old, what is new? Of course, we know what are we talking about. But as Fernand said, there are different legal and political instruments with different meanings, and many of them want to cover what here we call old and new at the same time, particularly in United Nations. Some others in Europe, they don't pretend the same. We know that the Framework Convention can be open to so-called new minorities in many aspects, but what about the European Charter of Regional Minority Languages, which explicitly excludes languages of migrants, for instance. So it's not so clear that we have a set of mechanisms, legal mechanisms for the one and for the other, which can be easily distinguished. But in any case, I wouldn't speak about common mechanisms to protect the minorities in general, but I would speak about a set of instruments and elements which can be used to protect minorities. It's a toolbox for minority protection, which is applied or implemented in different countries and in different contexts in a very, very different way. And even for the same country in a very different way for different minorities. So I would talk more about a set of mechanisms or set of instruments to protect minorities, which are used very differently. And if we talk about instruments to protect aliens, foreigners, or refugees, etc., and they contain very little about cultural elements, basically. In any case, if these are considered like two legal political fields, different legal political fields, I would be very much in favor of progressive integration of the two fields, because I think they emerge around the need of protection of diversity in general, of cultural diversity or identity diversity in our polities. And I'm not sure if the goal is different of these two sets of instruments. Probably the goal is different when looking from a minority now, when the aspiration is to replace the majority by a new majority, by a local majority. But if the final goal, and this is a very, very final aspiration, but if the final goal is that we create post-identity polities, so polities in which identity is not so relevant, so polities in which human rights can be enjoyed by anyone through his, her own identity and not in spite of it, then these two sets of instruments should merge or should be progressively integrated into one. Because at the end of the day, what we want to protect is, on the one hand, some elements, so objective elements, on the other hand, people, so rights of different people. And what we look for is equality, that's as I understand it. So equality can be or must be achieved through different ways because we have a different or a very diverse society. And in connection with this, I think what is relevant here for this debate is the different nature and dynamics of the different elements we consider when we talk about minorities. And maybe we can come back to this later during the debate. But I think the real difference is going to be not between old and new, but between the elements in themselves. For instance, language and religion, because the evolution in the future is going to be dramatically different of these two elements. And now, to try to respond somehow to the specific question formulated by Roberta to me, I think it should be the object of a very interesting research project. How so-called all minorities would react to extension of some protective measures to so-called new minorities. Would be very difficult to define the methodology of the project, but I think it would be very, very relevant. My hypothesis is that the reaction depends very much on the context of each particular minority group. When we are talking about very strong minorities, strong in a sense of size, number, and particularly power, when we have we find this power concentrated at the, for instance, the subnational regional level, I think there is a tendency, there is a discourse and there is a political attitude which is more open to tolerance and to diversity. But this is, I guess, is at the level of the political discourse, politically correct discourse. Behind that, normally there is a kind of aspiration and even an implementation of policies looking towards linguistic assimilation, even through the minority language. And we find examples of this both in Europe and also in North America. So at the end of the day, they will always maintain that there are kind of two levels of protection for the different elements, let's say language in particular. Language becomes a very, very strong factor of identity for these strong minorities, which are territorially concentrated. For those minorities which are in a very weak situation, yes, it can be seen as a threat for their aspirations, a kind of a competition of resources, and sometimes as an instrument used by the majority governments to dilute the diversity they represent. And we also find some examples using languages for that. So they put the families in the tension or the dichotomy to opt for teaching their children through the minority language or through worldwide languages like English, of course, but also Chinese or Arabic, etc. So normally it is seen with some, how to say, some caution. But in some particular minorities, it may happen, and this is again an hypothesis, it may happen that they are so weak that they see this as an opportunity. So because they have new allies in claiming or in asking for measures to protect diversity. It also depends on the kind of country they live in, because in countries where diversity is not considered at the public level, they could see more people asking for diversity as allies more than enemies. In some others, where all this diversity issue is more or less developed, I'm afraid that it is generally seen as a kind of a threat to their specific and historically rooted situation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Eduardo. Actually, Katharina, we have a new project ready, but and we really need this sort of empirical work, because just as an anecdotal knowledge, actually, from my experience by presenting the concept of all the new minorities, I have the sort of second reaction, in the sense that large minorities tend to be much more jealous of their own rights and status, and smaller, much more open to perhaps to have allies, I don't know, but a similar approach I found also in let's say northern cities, northern European cities, including also Italy, that are much more jealous of integration policies to be shared with migrants, for example, in comparison to those in the south of Italy, which are much more open to share the little they have. So my hypothesis perhaps is that when you have less to lose, then you are perhaps paradoxically more open to share the little you have. I don't know, it's something that perhaps we should really look into from a sociological point of view. But now I would like to extend my question, and also I encourage also the participants here to raise their hands and make questions. See that here from there's nothing in the chat, but I have a specific question to Katharina and her work, and please, Emanuele and Eduardo, comment if you want. But my question is about this hybrid identification that you raised in your study. And these hybrid identities are sometimes two sides of the same coin. There is a positive side where hybrid identification gives rise to multiple identities, but also have a negative side, so intersectional discrimination, more elements, more dimensions to be discriminated against. So my question is, this complexity of diversity, how can be addressed? How, from an institutional point of view? So how our schools, courts, public administration, hospitals can respond to this multiplication, in a sense, of diversities? You mentioned at a certain point that the second generation can be bridge builders that see diversity as an opportunity, as a resource, rather than a burden. But how can these bridge builders be somehow serve in the institutions, or serve or help the institutions to really render diversity a resource rather than a burden?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very interesting question. I think if I had an exhaustive answer to that, I would probably be, I don't know, advising whoever in the political sphere. But I will try my best with the concepts from the study here. So I think for young migrants, and especially second generation, it's quite difficult to find their role sometimes in society. So I think that they, at least from our participants, they very often mention this hybrid identification, so that they have parts from here and parts from there, and that this is important to them, that they get to keep both these parts. But of course, there's always the question, so when is the point reached when you don't have to justify, in a sense, that you belong somewhere? So when will you not be asked anymore about your background and about where do you really come from, and so on. So I think this is something that on the one hand they of course value this diverse identity, this hybrid identity that they have, but they also have a very strong desire of being accepted into the majority population, and being seen also as part of the majority population. I think this is something where perhaps we can also learn from old minorities. So, because you wouldn't think of an old minority, you know, as being not a part of the state demos or something like this. You know, of course they are citizens, but still they are not outside of the narrative of the nation, also, so to speak. Whereas migrants, I think in most cases they are left outside of this narrative. So perhaps there's also some room to learn and some room for improvements there. But regarding the bridge building function, I think the first thing that would be helpful would be just to listen to what they have to say on a number of things. So, for example, the respondents in our study, a large number of them is also, they went to school here, so they know the school system, they know what it feels like to be a foreigner in the school system, and I think they could probably provide us with quite a variety of new insights and ideas on how we could improve also the intercultural competence and dialogue in the school system. From an institutional perspective, I think quite a lot of things are already being done. So there is definitely increased awareness on the institutional side, also that there is increased diversity in societies, and this is something that they also have to deal with. So, for example, in schools, I think the role also of cultural mediators, of teachers that have received training to work with migrant students and so on. So in general, maybe in the society in general, there is something that is happening, that is being done. But maybe for the migrants themselves, I think it would be quite helpful to have them also more in the spotlight, so to speak, also. So other migrants or other young migrants can see that, look, this is someone with a migratory background who may be successful and so on, that this could be also a type of positive role model. But on the other hand, as you mentioned, this hybrid identification, it can also have a negative side. So maybe the sense of not belonging anywhere that was mentioned also, and of course also this if you are in the spotlight, then as to quote unquote say successful migrant, then maybe it's also not something that you want to be displayed as for your whole life, but maybe just as a successful person and in their own respect, without migration coming into it even at all. So I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword in many ways, yeah.
Thanks, Katharina. Before giving the word to Eduardo and Emanuele, I want to add, in addition to this question about hybrid identities, also a question from the audience, from Niccolò Alessi, whose question is the follow. New minorities may not strive for protection mechanisms because they don't see this possibility. Perhaps if the legal tools for protection or empowerment would be available for new minority groups too, they would use them or claim for them. This is something also for future service. So in addition to the question on how institutions can react to these multiple diversities and whether there is something that they can learn, institutions can learn from old minorities also to these new challenges. Do you think that new minorities don't have these legal tools and that's why they are not using them, or they are available or they are not? It's a matter of awareness, as Katharina was mentioning. Perhaps first Eduardo, yes, or? We have a question from the audience, but I'll give the floor. Thanks.
Thank you. I am Alexandra Zantaki, and I'm a professor of law and also the new UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights. And I found your presentation really interesting. I'm just trying to understand a bit more what is the main argument, because as I kind of look through your conclusions focus on non-discrimination and not positive measures. So you say that it's about non-discrimination, but international law has kind of resolved this. So irrespective of whether we call them minorities or not, the CERT convention, without calling them minorities, says that positive measures have to be taken for specific, also including in cultural activities. And the General Comment 21 on the right to participate in cultural activities says that very specifically that the right to participate in cultural activities means cultural activities of their community, not just the cultural activities of the state, of the majority. So if you were only to say, if your conclusions were only to say that the state should only give them non-discrimination protection, then this would water down the existing protection that they have from international law. And I suspect that this is not what you want to say. Do you want to say that in reaching for the better establishment of positive protection, we should not forget the basis, which is anti-discrimination measures? Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I will just answer very quickly. Thank you for the question. No, this indeed is not what I was trying to say. So the basics, I think, need to be established and need to be valued. What I was trying to say is more that it's not that we don't need necessarily positive measures, but I think that the political will in many cases is not there to implement these. So even for those, I don't know, things like language that I mentioned, where there is a certain, although it's not seen as the most important thing, but there is a wish to, for example, have the possibility to also learn migrant languages. I think here, because migration is so contested politically, I think this is the most difficulty, or the most challenging difficulty that we are facing here. So not necessarily that it's not possible or it's not feasible from the standards and the international standards and laws that are implemented, but really the local or even national policymakers that are not quite that interested, I think, in also using or seizing all the possibilities that they might already have from the standards of international law. So more a political thing, I think, yeah. Thank you.
Please, Eduardo.
Yes, two points, if I may. On the one hand, about migrants or new minorities using these legal instruments, I think when we analyze the claims of these groups, we have to consider they are very much conditioned by the situation and the context again. And normally the policies concerning integration rely on the principle that integration is achieved once you get a working permit and a job position in the labor market. And I think that's a mistake, because obviously identity issues will arise sooner or later, probably through so-called second generation or third generation, etc. But obviously the claims are shorter just because they are not in a position to claim, probably. And well, second point, I would like to put on the table another reflection about identities, if I may, knowing that maybe it's not very politically correct in this context. On the one hand, about multiple identities, I think we scholars tend to exaggerate about multiple identities, and we are happy talking about multiple identities and these dynamics, they are dynamic, they overlap, etc. But honestly, we don't know so many people that changed religion during her life, changed first or principal language during her life, not even change her favorite soccer club. So it's normally identities of people, of normal people. They are quite fixed, which we don't like to see this, but this is the world about on which we live. And also about hybrid identities. I think these so-called hybrid identities, I think they are either a new identity in itself or a new way of joining or reaching an existing identity. Because we also tend to think on identities as a fixed thing. We are probably by nature conservative, so we think in an identity has to be like frozen there. No, identity also changes the identity itself, incorporating these so-called hybrid identities, as it happens with individuals. I mean, you are Roberta. We all agree on that. You are Roberta, and you were Roberta 20 years ago, but obviously you have changed a lot in these last 20 years, but you are still Roberta. So it's one identity which has incorporated and probably leaving also things on the sides. But so this hybrid identity probably is the new way of being whatever, French, Tyrolean, Italian, etc., European, whatever. So, and I think we have a tend to exaggerate on these phenomena. in comparison with the reality about we are debating.
Thanks, Eduardo. I think that on the multiple identities, if I may, the main problem is that many people just don't want to be identified just by one aspect. This is the main problem. So that many Muslims, for example, are identified just by their religion belonging. And these are women by only gender. And the discussion, the debate, and what also Katharina found out in her research is that people increasingly want that also other dimensions of their identity that might be also fixed, not necessarily changing over time. So the dimensions of their identity are also important. So. Yeah, exactly. So I'm not just, I don't know, Roberta the researcher. I'm also Roberta the sailor, the whatever, or other things that I would like to be. Absolutely. But Emanuele, sorry, you are a bit left apart, but please
Roberta,
keep the floor.
Can I ask a couple of questions to Katharina?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah,
I had two questions about the conclusion. One is on the conclusions and one is on the policy recommendations. So the first question is about the first point of the conclusion. I was wondering if you can make more explicit what you mean when you say migrants are aware of their position in society, and you use the conjunction and do not strive for protection mechanism as much as what we call old minorities do. So what do you exactly mean by they are aware of their position in society and do not strive for protection mechanisms?
Do you want to do the second part, or should I respond to the first one first?
As you like.
We have a few minutes.
Okay, yeah, I will be very brief, and we can perhaps discuss all additional things then tomorrow also as well. But I just wanted to say on the position in society, I think this correlates to what I said before on the political difficulty and on the delicacy perhaps of migration as a topic. So they are quite aware that they are also regarded in a certain way, so that they are coming to the country and may not have as strong as a claim also to protection as old minorities, at least in the eyes of many commentators or political parties and so on. So this is what I meant with the awareness, and also it's also not something that has appeared that it's very close to them or very important to them, to have these very far-reaching provisions like, I don't know, school systems in minority languages or something like that national minorities hold. So it seems that both they know that it's difficult for them to reach it, but also on the other hand, it's not that important to them. And then, of course, we can discuss how the correlation between these two things happens, yeah.
I think we are really at the end of our seminar. I want to really thank Katharina once again, because I think that at least what I learned from her study is a lesson that also we should bring also in our studies on national minorities. So what emerged in your study is that many of your respondents didn't want special measures or shortcuts, in a sense. They want they want equality, they want integration, and they don't want a sort of defensive protection. And this is something that perhaps also many old minorities should learn. No assimilation, no dilution of diversity, but equal opportunities. But perhaps we will have time and other opportunities to discuss on these issues. I wish to thank our panelists and all of you who attended the seminar here and online. And a special thank to the colleagues of the Eurac Research who have made this webinar possible, in particular Alexandra Tomaselli, who has collected the question. So I hope you enjoyed the discussion. Thanks again to all of you, in particular our panelists, and goodbye.
Thank you and good evening.